The clatter of silverware against porcelain echoed in the otherwise too quiet dining room. Outside, the snow had begun its soft descent, muffling the world, promising a pristine white Christmas. Inside, the air was thick with a different kind of chill. I watched my mother, her face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, a slight smirk playing on her lips as she carefully sliced into her roast beef. My father, as usual, was engrossed in his phone, a silent observer in his own home. My brother, Mark, was mid-anecdote, his voice a little too loud, trying to fill the void. "You know, dear," my mother said, her voice cutting through Mark's story like a precisely aimed laser, "you've been so wonderfully generous this year. Always there when I need something. Like a very reliable bank account." The spoon I was holding slipped from my fingers, hitting the plate with a sharp, discordant clang. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a tiny sonic disruption in the carefully constructed facade of our family Christmas Eve. My eyes met hers. There was no apology, no hint of regret. Just a cool, assessing gaze that said, the roast beef on her plate suddenly seemed like an accusation. My father finally looked up, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face at the sudden silence, before returning to his screen. Mark, bless his oblivious heart, just blinked. "Mom, what are you talking about?" I asked, my voice dangerously low, carefully calibrated to sound confused rather than angry. "Oh, just thinking aloud," she waved a dismissive hand, reaching for the gravy boat. "It's lovely, isn't it? This family. Everyone contributing. And you, bless your heart, you're always the one holding the purse strings." She smiled, a tight, proprietorial smile that didn't reach her eyes. The warmth of the room suddenly felt artificial, a veneer over something much colder. The perfect Christmas Eve, meticulously planned and executed for years, now felt like a meticulously staged play, and I had just realized I was playing the unwitting fool. I remember another Christmas, maybe 10 years ago. It was right after Grandma Eleanor passed. A formidable woman, Grandma Eleanor, who had amassed a tidy sum from shrewd investments and a lifetime of careful saving. She'd always been a bit estranged from my mother, a quiet disapproval simmering beneath polite surface interactions. When the will was read, it was clear Grandma Eleanor had a practical mind. She'd left a significant portion to her grandchildren, divided equally, but with stipulations. For Mark and me, it was tied to us reaching certain financial milestones by the time we turned 30. For my mother, it was a substantial sum, but it came with a very specific codicil. She was to use it to support the ongoing education and well-being of her children. It was a subtle jab, a final, passive-aggressive nudge from beyond the grave. My mother had bristled at the wording, of course. Well-being, she'd sniffed, clutching the lawyer's letter like it was a death warrant. What does that even mean? I'm perfectly capable of deciding what constitutes my children's well-being. My father had just shrugged, already mentally spending his share. But I, then 24 and fresh out of college, already feeling the pressure of student loan debt and the general uncertainty of early adulthood, had seen it as a lifeline. A safety net. For the next few years, my mother had been accommodating. Small requests for tuition help, contributions towards a down payment on my first apartment, even a surprisingly generous gift towards my wedding. It felt like the inheritance was finally fulfilling its intended purpose. Until it wasn't. The requests became more frequent, less about actual need and more about convenience. A new car for Mark because his was getting too old. A lavish vacation for her and Dad because they'd deserved a break. Each time, I'd dutifully obliged, offering up chunks of my own savings, telling myself it was for family, for love, for Grandma Eleanor's spirit. There was one particularly egregious instance. I was saving for a down payment on a house, meticulously tracking every penny. She'd called, her voice laced with a theatrical urgency. Her furnace had broken down, it was the dead of winter, and the repairman quoted an astronomical sum. She was stranded. Could I just lend her the money? I'd hesitated, the words "loan" sticking in my throat. It was already a significant amount, and it would set my own plans back by at least 6 months. But the thought of her freezing, the guilt of refusing, gnawed at me. I transferred the money, her effusive thanks dripping with insincerity. A week later, I saw a Facebook post of her and Dad on a cruise to the Caribbean, sun-drenched and carefree. The furnace, I later learned from a cousin who'd heard it through the grapevine, had been fixed for a fraction of the quoted price by a friend of hers. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns. The subtle manipulation, the veiled guilt trips, the assumption of my perpetual financial availability. I'd learned to keep my mouth shut, to nod and agree, to compartmentalize my own financial goals from her insatiable needs. It was easier than fighting, easier than explaining, easier than facing the inevitable disappointment and passive-aggressive remarks that would follow any dissent. I became adept at the art of quiet compliance. And then came Christmas Eve. The snow outside was a soft blanket of silence. Inside, the dining room glowed with the warm, deceptive light of candles. My mother's words, delivered with such casual cruelty, had landed like a physical blow. The analogy wasn't just accurate, it was a declaration. I was no longer a son, a sibling, a family member. I was a resource. A tool. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. I swallowed, the lump in my throat feeling like a stone. Mark was still talking about a football game, his enthusiasm a stark contrast to the sudden, suffocating weight in the room. My father was back on his phone, a silent sentinel of indifference. But I wasn't listening to Mark. I was listening to the echo of my mother's words, dissecting them, replaying them, tasting their bitter truth. I pushed my plate away, the untouched roast beef a monument to my shattered appetite. My gaze drifted to the ornate silver frame on the sideboard. It held a picture of a much younger me, beaming, holding a diploma. The diploma that had cost so much, the one I'd worked so hard for, the one that had indirectly led me to this point. I think I'm going to step out for a bit, I said, my voice surprisingly steady, though I felt like I was vibrating. My mother glanced up, a flicker of something, concern? Annoyance? Crossing her face. Now? On Christmas Eve? It's snowing, dear. Just a short walk, I replied, standing up. The scraping of my chair against the hardwood floor was loud, intrusive. I need some air. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out of the dining room, through the hushed living room, and out the front door. The cold air was a shock, a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. The snow had intensified, falling in large, lazy flakes that dusted my hair and shoulders. I walked down the driveway, the crunch of snow under my boots the only sound. My car was parked further down the street, a deliberate choice I'd made months ago, a small act of strategic distance. I reached it, my fingers numb as I fumbled for the keys. I sat inside, the engine rumbling to life, a cocoon of warmth against the biting wind. I didn't drive away immediately. Instead, I pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over a name I hadn't dialed in years. It was the name of the estate lawyer who had handled Grandma Eleanor's will. I took a deep breath and pressed call. The lawyer's voice, dry and professional, answered on the second ring. I kept my voice low, measured. Hello, Mr. Henderson. I'm calling about Grandma Eleanor's estate. Specifically, the codicil regarding my mother's distribution. There was a brief pause. Ah, yes. I remember. A rather unique stipulation, if I recall correctly. About supporting her children's education and well-being. Precisely, I said, my voice gaining a quiet strength. I believe my mother may have misinterpreted the terms. Or perhaps, been rather loose with her interpretation over the years. I spent the next hour on the phone, my hands surprisingly steady, my mind sharp and clear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply laid out the facts, referencing specific dates, amounts, and the exact wording of the will. I mentioned the car for Mark, the vacations, the furnace repair. I spoke about my own financial goals, my own struggles, and how her actions had directly impacted them. I painted a picture, not of a vindictive son, but of a son who had been systematically exploited. Mr. Henderson listened patiently, interjecting occasionally with clarifying questions. He explained the legal recourse available, the process of contesting expenditures made from the inheritance, the possibility of an independent audit. He assured me that while challenging, it was certainly not impossible. When I hung up, the engine had been running for nearly an hour. The car was warm, but I felt a deep, icy calm settle over me. I knew what I had to do. It wouldn't be immediate. It would be a slow, deliberate dismantling. A quiet, surgical removal of access. I drove home, the snow now falling in earnest, blurring the edges of the world. I parked back in my usual spot. The house was quiet. I slipped in through the back door, leaving my wet coat in the mudroom. I tiptoed upstairs, not out of stealth, but out of a strange sense of reverence for the sleeping household. The next morning, the house was alive with the usual Christmas Day chaos. Presents were opened, laughter echoed, and the smell of baking filled the air. My mother, however, seemed unusually agitated. She kept glancing at her phone, her brow furrowed. "Did you get my text, dear?" she asked, sidling up to me in the kitchen. "Which one?" I asked innocently, buttering a piece of toast. "The one about my credit card," she huffed. "It's been declined. 3 times. At the grocery store. Can you believe it? Something must be wrong with the system. Can you just look into it?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. "I don't have access to your credit card, Mom." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't be silly. You always manage these things for me." "Not anymore," I said, my voice calm and even. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a folded document. It was a letter from Mr. Henderson's office, dated December 26, outlining the initial steps of a legal challenge to the distribution of Grandma Eleanor's estate. I placed it on the counter between us, its crisp white edges stark against the worn wood. Her eyes flicked to the letter, then back to my face. The color drained from her cheeks. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's a formal request for an accounting of the funds distributed from Grandma Eleanor's estate," I explained. "And a notice that all future distributions are being temporarily suspended pending an independent review." I paused, letting the words sink in. "It also states that any expenditures made by you, from those funds, that are not demonstrably for the education and well-being of your children, will be subject to repayment. With interest." Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. "You can't do this." "I can," I said, meeting her gaze directly. "And I am." "You called me a bank account." "Well, the account is now closed. The funds have been frozen." The rest of the day was a masterclass in controlled chaos. My father, finally roused from his passive indifference, exploded in a fury, demanding I explain myself. Mark, bewildered and caught in the crossfire, kept asking what was going on. My mother alternated between tearful pleas and venomous accusations, her carefully constructed facade crumbling around her. The flying monkeys descended quickly. My aunt, my mother's sister, called in tears, convinced I was ruining Christmas. My father's brother, ever the pragmatist, tried to mediate, suggesting a compromise. But my resolve was unshakable. I had spent years being bled dry, my generosity exploited. Now, it was time for a reckoning. The legal proceedings were protracted and unpleasant. My mother, stripped of her financial lifeline, was forced to confront the consequences of her entitlement. Her creditors began to circle. The lavish lifestyle she had cultivated, funded by my grandmother's legacy and my own hard-earned money, began to unravel. She was forced to sell her vacation home, then downsize her car. Mark, initially furious, eventually came to understand the extent of my mother's manipulation and offered his quiet support. My father, pragmatic to the end, simply adjusted his own spending habits. The satisfaction wasn't in their hardship. It was in the quiet, absolute dismantling of a narrative that had kept me trapped for so long. The narrative where I was merely a resource, a means to an end. The cold, precise action, the legal documents, the frozen accounts, these were not acts of anger, but acts of liberation. My mother never apologized. She never acknowledged the depth of her betrayal. But her silence, the panicked texts, the desperate phone calls that eventually dwindled to nothing, spoke volumes. She had called me a bank account. And I had shown her the power of a withdrawal. The silence that followed was deafening, and for the first time in years, it felt like my own.